Picture America in 1870. The Civil War has ended. The Transcontinental Railroad has just been completed. And across the Great Plains, something unprecedented is happening. Millions upon millions of cattle are being driven north from Texas, longhorns mostly, heading toward the railroad towns of Kansas, where they'll be shipped east to feed a hungry nation. This is the world before feedlots. A world where cattle roamed free range, grazing on natural grasslands, taking 3 to 5 years to reach market weight. A world where the relationship between rancher and animal, between land and livestock, followed rhythms established over centuries. But standing at that crossroads of American history, nobody could have predicted what was coming. Nobody could have imagined that within a century, the entire architecture of meat production would be revolutionized, concentrated, and transformed into something unrecognizable from its origins. This is the story of feedlots. Not just the physical structures, those massive industrial operations that now produce over 90% of America's beef, but the economic forces, the political battles, the environmental consequences, and the human cost of an agricultural revolution that changed everything about how we eat. This is a story about efficiency taken to its extreme, about profit margins measured in pennies per pound, multiplied across millions of animals, about corporate consolidation and family farmers squeezed out of existence, about antibiotic resistance, environmental devastation, and a food system that produces abundance while generating profound questions about sustainability, animal welfare, and human health. The dark secret behind feedlots isn't just what happens inside those pens. It's how an entire nation became dependent on an industrial system that most people never see, never question, and barely understand, even though it shapes the most intimate act we perform multiple times every day, eating. To understand the feedlot, you have to understand what came before it. And that requires traveling back to a vanished America, one that existed in the decades following the Civil War. In 1867, an Illinois livestock trader named Joseph McCoy had a vision. The Texas plains were overrun with cattle, perhaps 5 million head of them, descendants of Spanish cattle that had gone feral over generations. These animals were essentially free for the taking. Meanwhile, the eastern cities were full of people with money and appetites for beef. The problem was getting the cattle to market. McCoy solved it by establishing Abilene, Kansas, as a shipping point on the Kansas Pacific Railroad. He built stockyards, hotels for cattlemen, and loading facilities. Then he sent word south, "Bring your cattle here, and we'll ship them east." What followed was one of the most iconic eras in American history: the long cattle drives. From 1867 to the mid-1880s, cowboys drove millions of cattle north along trails like the Chisholm Trail and the Goodnight Loving Trail. These drives took months. Cattle would graze as they walked, moving 10 to 15 miles per day, gaining weight on the journey. The economics were simple but compelling. A longhorn that cost $4 in Texas might sell for $40 in Kansas. The journey was dangerous: rivers to ford, Native American territory to cross, rustlers to avoid, but the profit margins made it worthwhile. But this system had a fundamental limitation. It was slow, unpredictable, and dependent on weather, grass conditions, and luck. As American cities exploded in population during the late 19th century, Chicago alone grew from 300,000 people in 1870 to 1.7 million by 1900. The demand for meat intensified. The old system couldn't keep pace. The real transformation began in Chicago. The Union Stockyards, which opened in 1865, became the epicenter of American meat production. At its peak, the facility covered over a square mile and could hold 75,000 cattle, 125,000 pigs, and 22,000 sheep simultaneously. It was here that industrialization began to reshape the ancient business of turning animals into food. Gustavus Swift revolutionized the industry by inventing the refrigerated railroad car in 1878, allowing dressed beef to be shipped long distances. Philip Armour built a meat-packing empire that employed thousands and processed cattle with assembly line efficiency that would later inspire Henry Ford. But the animals arriving at these facilities were still range-fed cattle that had taken years to mature. They were lean, tough, and variable in quality. Some visionary entrepreneurs began asking a radical question: what if we could finish cattle faster? What if we could take those skinny range cattle and fatten them up quickly before slaughter, producing more tender, consistent meat? The answer to that question would create the feedlot industry. The concept of feeding cattle grain to fatten them wasn't entirely new. Wealthy landowners had been finishing cattle on grain for special occasions since ancient times. But doing it systematically, at scale, as a business model, that was revolutionary. The early pioneers of intensive cattle feeding emerged in the American Midwest in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Farmers who raised corn, the dominant crop of the heartland, realized they could add value to their grain by feeding it to cattle rather than shipping it to market directly. A bushel of corn might sell for 50 cents, but that same corn, converted into beef, could generate several dollars in revenue. These early feeding operations were small by today's standards, maybe 20 to 50 head of cattle at a time. Farmers would buy cattle from the range, confine them in small pens or barns, and feed them corn silage, and hay for several months. The concentrated diet caused the cattle to gain weight rapidly and develop the marbling, intramuscular fat that makes beef tender and flavorful. The results were remarkable. A grass-fed steer might take 4 to 5 years to reach 1,000 pounds. A grain-fed steer could reach 1,200 pounds in 18 months to 2 years. The economic implications were staggering. Faster turnover meant more cattle processed per year, per acre, per dollar of investment. But the real explosion of feedlot technology came after World War II, driven by a convergence of factors that would reshape American agriculture entirely. First, the war effort had stimulated massive increases in chemical fertilizer production. Factories that had made explosives were retooled to produce nitrogen fertilizer. This cheap nitrogen allowed farmers to grow corn at unprecedented yields. Between 1940 and 1970, average corn yields per acre doubled, and they would double again by 2000. America was suddenly awash in cheap grain. Second, the federal government actively encouraged grain production through price supports and subsidies established in the New Deal and expanded in subsequent farm bills. Farmers were essentially guaranteed a market for their corn at supported prices. This created a structural incentive to produce as much grain as possible, and feeding it to cattle was one of the most profitable uses. Third, scientific advances in animal nutrition were revealing exactly how to maximize weight gain in cattle. Researchers determined the optimal ratios of energy to protein, the digestibility of different feed ingredients, and how to supplement diets with vitamins and minerals. Feeding cattle became less of an art and more of a science, a precise calculation designed to convert grain into meat at maximum efficiency. Fourth, antibiotics became widely available. In 1949, researchers discovered that adding small amounts of antibiotics to animal feed dramatically increased growth rates. The mechanism wasn't entirely clear. It likely involved reducing subclinical infections and altering gut bacteria, but the effect was undeniable. Cattle receiving antibiotic feed additives gained weight 10 to 15% faster than those without. In an industry where profit margins were measured in pennies per pound, this was revolutionary. By the 1950s and 1960s, the modern feedlot was taking shape. These operations were moving away from the Midwest, where land was becoming expensive and urbanization was encroaching, and relocating to the Great Plains, particularly Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and the Texas Panhandle. Here, land was cheap, labor was available, and the operations could be located near grain production. The scale was increasing exponentially. A large feedlot in 1950 might have held 5,000 head. By 1970, operations with 50,000 head were becoming common. Today, the largest feedlots, called mega feedlots, can hold over 100,000 cattle simultaneously. Earl Brookover, who pioneered large-scale feedlot operations in Colorado in the 1950s, described his philosophy simply: the name of the game is efficiency. You want to put the maximum amount of weight on an animal in the minimum amount of time at the lowest possible cost. This became the industry's guiding principle and its curse. By the 1970s, the feedlot industry had achieved something unprecedented in agricultural history. It had transformed a living animal into a unit of industrial production, as standardized and predictable as any widget coming off an assembly line. The system that emerged was brutally efficient. Here's how it worked, and still works today. Cattle begin their lives on cow-calf operations, typically in areas where grass is abundant. For the first 6 to 9 months, calves nurse from their mothers and graze on pasture. This part of the process remains relatively traditional and extensive. Then comes the first major transition. Calves are weaned and moved to operations called backgrounders or stockers, where they continue grazing but may receive some supplemental feed. This phase lasts several months and brings the animals to 600 to 800 pounds, roughly half their final weight. Then comes the feedlot. Young cattle, now called feeder cattle, are transported, often hundreds or thousands of miles, to massive finishing operations. And here's where the industrial system kicks into high gear. Upon arrival, cattle are processed with assembly line efficiency. They're given identification tags, vaccinated against diseases, treated for parasites, and often implanted with growth-promoting hormones, typically a combination of estrogen and testosterone analogs that can increase growth rates by 10 to 20%. They're sorted by size and sex into pens that might hold 100 to 300 animals each. Then the feeding begins. Modern feedlot rations are precisely calibrated mixtures designed for one purpose: maximum weight gain at minimum cost. A typical finishing diet consists of 70 to 90% corn, sorghum, or other grains, 5-10% protein supplement, often soybean meal, 5-10% roughage, corn stalks, hay or silage, vitamins, minerals, and feed additives, ionophores, a type of antibiotic, to improve feed efficiency. This is not a diet that cattle evolved to eat. Ruminants, animals like cattle with multi-chambered stomachs, are designed to digest cellulose from grass. Their digestive systems host complex microbial ecosystems that break down plant fiber. When you suddenly switch them to a high-starch grain diet, you fundamentally alter that ecosystem. The consequences are significant. Grain feeding can cause acidosis, a dangerous condition where the rumen becomes too acidic, damaging its lining and potentially killing the animal. To manage this, feedlot cattle are gradually transitioned from forage to grain over several weeks, allowing their gut bacteria to adapt. Even then, many cattle experience subclinical acidosis, liver abscesses, and digestive problems. But from an economic standpoint, it works spectacularly well. On a feedlot diet, cattle gain 3 to 4 pounds per day, roughly triple the rate of grass-fed cattle. In 120 to 180 days, they'll put on 400 to 600 pounds, reaching market weight of 1,200 to 1,400 pounds. Then they're shipped to slaughter, and the cycle begins again with new arrivals. The efficiency metrics are staggering. A modern feedlot converts approximately 6 pounds of feed into 1 pound of beef, far more efficient than historical grazing systems. A single feedlot can finish 100,000 head annually, producing over 60 million pounds of beef per year. But efficiency came with costs that weren't immediately apparent, or at least, weren't immediately acknowledged. The concentration of animals created unprecedented environmental challenges. A feedlot with 50,000 cattle produces as much waste as a city of 500,000 people, but without any sewage treatment system. The manure accumulates in the pens, creating vast quantities of nitrogen and phosphorus that can contaminate groundwater and surface water. The smell can be detected for miles. The grain-based system created new health problems. Cattle-fed high-starch diets develop different gut bacteria than grass-fed animals, including increased levels of E. coli 0157, H7, a dangerous pathogen that can contaminate meat during slaughter and cause severe illness or death in humans. The 1993 Jack-in-the-Box outbreak, which killed 4 children and sickened hundreds, was traced to beef contaminated with this feedlot-associated pathogen. The routine use of antibiotics in feed, intended to promote growth and prevent disease in crowded conditions, was breeding antibiotic-resistant bacteria. By the 1990s, researchers were documenting resistance genes jumping from agricultural bacteria to human pathogens, contributing to a growing public health crisis. And the economics were creating a consolidation crisis. As feedlots grew larger and more efficient, they could produce beef more cheaply than smaller operations. This created a brutal competitive dynamic where scale begot scale. Family farmers who had background and finished cattle for generations found themselves unable to compete. Between 1980 and 2000, the number of cattle operations in America declined by over 50%, while total cattle numbers remained roughly stable. The industry was consolidating into fewer, larger hands. By the turn of the 21st century, just 13 companies controlled 55% of American cattle feeding capacity. 4 companies, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef, controlled over 80% of beef slaughter. The feedlot system had achieved maximum efficiency, but it had also created an unprecedented concentration of economic power. In the spring of 2005, residents of Milford, Utah, woke to find thousands of dead birds around a feedlot complex. Starlings, blackbirds, and other species lay dead in the snow. The cause was eventually traced to a pesticide used in cattle feed, but the incident revealed something larger. Feedlots have become ecologically complex systems with far-reaching impacts that extended well beyond the fence line. The environmental footprint of industrial cattle feeding is immense and multifaceted. Let's start with water. A single feedlot steer consumes approximately 3,000 gallons of water during its 150-day finishing period, for drinking, feed processing, and cleaning. Multiply that by the millions of cattle in feedlots at any given time, and you're looking at billions of gallons of water annually, much of it drawn from aquifers that are being depleted faster than they're recharged. The Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies the Great Plains and supplies water for much of America's cattle feeding industry, is being mined at alarming rates. In some areas, water levels have dropped over 100 feet since industrial agriculture intensified. At current rates, portions of the aquifer will be effectively depleted within decades, creating an existential threat to the feedlot system and the agricultural economy it supports. Then there's the manure problem. It's difficult for most people to conceptualize just how much waste 100,000 cattle produce. The answer is approximately 2.5 million pounds per day, over 900 million pounds per year from a single large facility. This manure is a complex mixture of organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus, pathogens, hormones, antibiotics, and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In theory, manure is a valuable fertilizer. In practice, the concentration is the problem. There's simply too much waste in too small an area to be safely applied to nearby farmland. While some feedlots have developed manure management systems, composting operations, biogas digesters, or long-distance hauling to crop fields, many simply accumulate it in storage ponds or spread it on nearby land at rates that exceed what the soil can safely absorb. The result is nutrient pollution on a massive scale. Nitrogen from feedlots leaches into groundwater, contaminating drinking water supplies with nitrates that can cause blue baby syndrome in infants. Phosphorus runs off into surface waters, fueling algae blooms that create dead zones in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. The hypoxic dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, an area the size of New Jersey where oxygen levels are too low to support most marine life, is fed substantially by nitrogen and phosphorus flowing down the Mississippi River from Midwestern agricultural operations, including feedlots. The air quality impacts are equally severe. Feedlots emit ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds. The ammonia reacts in the atmosphere to form fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, that contributes to respiratory disease and cardiovascular problems. Studies in communities near large feedlots have documented elevated rates of asthma, especially in children. One 2008 study in Iowa found that children living within 2 miles of large cattle operations were nearly 3 times more likely to develop asthma than children living farther away. The economic burden of these health impacts, emergency room visits, medication costs, lost workdays, is substantial but rarely accounted for in calculating the efficiency of feedlot beef production. And then there's climate change. The livestock sector overall contributes approximately 14 to 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, more than all transportation combined. Feedlots are part of this system. The grain production that feeds them requires vast amounts of fossil fuel-based fertilizer. The cattle themselves produce methane, a greenhouse gas 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year time frame, through their digestive processes. The manure storage systems emit both methane and nitrous oxide, another potent greenhouse gas. A 2019 study calculated that producing 1 kilogram of feedlot beef generates approximately 30 kilograms of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases when you account for the full production chain, from growing feed to processing the final meat. Multiplied across the billions of pounds of feedlot beef produced annually, the climate impact is immense. But perhaps the most troubling hidden cost is antibiotic resistance. In 2017, approximately 10.5 million kilograms of medically important antibiotics were sold for use in American livestock, roughly 3 times the amount used in human medicine. The majority of these antibiotics aren't used to treat sick animals. They're used as growth promoters and prophylactic treatments in healthy animals. This practice creates ideal conditions for bacteria to develop resistance. When antibiotics are used continuously at subtherapeutic doses, levels high enough to exert selective pressure but low enough that bacteria aren't killed outright, resistant strains have a survival advantage. These resistant bacteria can then transfer resistance genes to other bacteria, including human pathogens, through a process called horizontal gene transfer. The consequences are now becoming clear. The CDC estimates that at least 2.8 million antibiotic-resistant infections occur in the United States each year, resulting in more than 35,000 deaths. While not all resistance originates from agriculture, studies have documented resistance genes moving from livestock operations into human pathogens. In 2019, researchers traced an outbreak of a multi-drug-resistant Salmonella strain to beef from a single slaughterhouse that processed cattle from several large feedlots. The bacteria carried resistance genes to 8 different antibiotics. Nearly 300 people across 29 states were infected. 1 died. Dr. Lance Price, director of the Antibiotic Resistance Action Center, has called agricultural antibiotic use a slow-moving pandemic that we're creating ourselves. The World Health Organization has declared antibiotic resistance one of the top 10 global public health threats. Yet the feedlot industry continues to rely heavily on antibiotics, not because the animals are sick, but because the system cannot function efficiently without them. The economic structure has created a perverse dynamic. Individual feedlot operators have strong incentives to use antibiotics. They increase profit margins, while society bears the collective cost of resistance, measured in deaths, medical expenses, and the loss of effective antibiotics for treating human disease. It's a textbook example of what economists call an externality, a cost imposed on others who have no say in the decision. And this pattern repeats across every hidden cost of the feedlot system. The operators capture the efficiency gains and profit margins. Society pays for the polluted water, degraded air, depleted aquifers, antibiotic resistance, climate change, and public health impacts. The beef in the grocery store looks cheap, but that's because the true costs have been externalized, scattered across communities, ecosystems, and future generations. Not everyone accepted the feedlot system passively. As the industry grew and its impacts became more apparent, resistance emerged from multiple directions. From family ranchers being squeezed out, from environmentalists documenting pollution, from public health advocates worried about antibiotic resistance and foodborne illness, and from communities fighting to keep mega feedlots out of their backyards. One of the earliest and most sustained challenges came from what might seem an unlikely source: traditional cattle ranchers. Many multi-generation ranching families watched in dismay as the feedlot system transformed their industry. The consolidation of cattle feeding into large corporate operations meant that ranchers had fewer buyers for their cattle and less negotiating power. Meanwhile, the beef they produced, grass-fed, range-raised, was being devalued in a market that prized the consistency and marbling of grain-fed beef. In the 1970s and 1980s, groups like the National Farmers Organization and the American Agriculture Movement organized protests and campaigns highlighting how concentration in the feedlot and packing industries was squeezing family farmers. Their analysis was prescient. As the industry consolidated, ranchers increasingly became price takers rather than price makers, forced to accept whatever the few dominant buyers offered. The economic pressure was relentless. In 1980, ranchers received approximately 65 cents of every dollar consumers spent on beef. By 2020, that figure had fallen to below 40 cents, with the lion's share going to the consolidated feedlot and packing companies. Thousands of family ranching operations, some operating for 4 or 5 generations, were forced out of business, unable to compete in a system designed for maximum scale and minimum cost. Environmental resistance emerged forcefully in the 1990s. The 1997 Fiesteria outbreak in North Carolina, though linked to hog operations rather than cattle, awakened many communities to the dangers of concentrated animal operations. When nutrient pollution from industrial animal agriculture fueled toxic algae blooms that killed millions of fish and caused illness in humans, it became impossible to ignore the environmental costs. Organizations like the Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, and Waterkeeper Alliance began targeting feedlots with lawsuits under the Clean Water Act. In 2003, the EPA was forced to establish new regulations for concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, requiring the largest facilities to obtain permits and implement nutrient management plans. The regulations were a step forward, but enforcement remained weak, and many facilities found ways to avoid classification as CAFOs. Perhaps most significantly, the feedlot system began facing consumer resistance. The series of foodborne illness outbreaks in the 1990s and 2000s, E. coli in beef, Salmonella in ground meat, raised disturbing questions about whether the industrial system was truly producing safer food. When investigators traced these outbreaks back to the conditions in feedlots and slaughterhouses, consumers began demanding alternatives. The organic food movement, which had existed on the margins for decades, suddenly gained mainstream traction. Whole Foods, a store built around the idea that food production methods matter, grew from a single Austin location in 1980 to a national chain with hundreds of stores by 2010. Books like Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser and Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma became bestsellers by documenting the realities of industrial meat production. Grass-fed beef emerged as a premium alternative. Ranchers who had held on to traditional practices suddenly found a market willing to pay more for cattle raised entirely on pasture, without grain finishing or feedlot exposure. By 2020, grass-fed beef was a $4 billion market, growing at double-digit rates annually. While still a small fraction of total beef production, it represented something important: proof that alternative systems could be economically viable. The antibiotic resistance crisis brought regulatory attention. In 2017, the FDA finally implemented rules requiring veterinary oversight for medically important antibiotics in livestock, ending the practice of buying antibiotics over the counter for use as growth promoters. Major fast food chains and restaurant groups began demanding antibiotic-free beef from their suppliers. Companies like Chipotle and Panera made antibiotic-free meat a central part of their brand identity. But perhaps the most existential challenge to the feedlot system comes from an unexpected direction: alternative proteins. Companies like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat have developed plant-based products that mimic the taste and texture of beef, targeting the feedlot system's environmental and ethical vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, cellular agriculture companies are developing methods to grow real beef from animal cells without ever raising or slaughtering cattle. These technologies are still in early stages, but their growth has been explosive. Between 2019 and 2021, investment in alternative protein companies exceeded $3 billion. Major meat companies, including Tyson and Cargill, have invested in these startups, essentially hedging their bets on the future of protein. If these technologies achieve price parity with conventional beef, something that could happen within a decade, they could fundamentally disrupt the feedlot system. The industry has responded with its own resistance. Lobbying groups have successfully pushed truth in labeling laws in over a dozen states, prohibiting plant-based products from using terms like meat or beef. Trade associations have funded campaigns highlighting the nutritional benefits of beef and the environmental stewardship of ranchers. Some feedlot operators have invested in sustainability improvements, installing biogas digesters to capture methane, implementing water recycling systems, and improving animal welfare standards. But these improvements, while genuine, often feel incremental compared to the scale of the challenges. The fundamental model, concentrating tens of thousands of animals in confined spaces, feeding them grain-based diets that require massive agricultural inputs, and managing the resulting waste and environmental impacts, remains essentially unchanged from the system that emerged in the 1960s. Stand today on the observation deck at one of the mega feedlots in the Texas Panhandle, if they'd let you, which they mostly won't, and what you see is staggering in its scale and implications. Pens stretching to the horizon, each holding hundreds of cattle. Feed trucks moving along the fence lines, distributing precisely calibrated rations. Dust hanging in the air. The smell hitting you like a physical force. And underneath it all, the constant sound. Thousands of cattle lowing, moving, eating, existing in a space that has been engineered with one purpose in mind: converting grain to meat as efficiently as possible. This is the culmination of a 150-year transformation in how America produces food. What began as an attempt to add value to surplus grain, to turn the abundance of the Midwest into something more profitable, has become a system that now defines how most of the developed world eats meat. The feedlot system's achievements are real and significant. It has made beef affordable for tens of millions of people who couldn't have afforded it otherwise. It has reduced the land required to produce a pound of beef by approximately 60% compared to traditional grazing systems. It has created a food supply that is consistent, abundant, and, despite periodic outbreaks, generally safe by historical standards. The average American now eats approximately 60 pounds of beef per year, roughly triple the consumption of a century ago. This abundance, this cheap protein, has been achieved because the feedlot system works spectacularly well at what it was designed to do: produce large quantities of beef at the lowest possible cost. But cost, we've learned, is a complicated concept. The price tag on a pound of ground beef reflects the corn, the labor, the transportation, and the razor-thin profit margins of an intensely competitive industry. What it doesn't reflect are the depleted aquifers, the contaminated waterways, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the greenhouse gas emissions, the concentrated corporate power, and the communities that have lost their economic autonomy. These costs are real, they're just hidden, diffused across society and time in ways that don't show up at the checkout counter. The feedlot system also represents something larger, a particular vision of progress and efficiency that dominated 20th century thinking. The idea that bigger is better, that technology can solve any problem, that nature should be controlled and optimized for human benefit, that the market will sort everything out. These assumptions shaped not just agriculture but nearly every aspect of modern life. And now, in the 21st century, we're being forced to reckon with the consequences of that vision. Climate change makes it impossible to ignore the carbon intensity of our food systems. Antibiotic resistance reminds us that we can't endlessly externalize costs onto microbial ecosystems. Water scarcity highlights the limits of mining natural resources as if they're infinite. Wealth concentration demonstrates that market efficiency doesn't necessarily translate to broad-based prosperity. The feedlot, in this sense, is a microcosm, a physical manifestation of an entire approach to how humans should organize themselves on the planet. And the questions it raises aren't just about cattle or agriculture. They're about whether the systems we built during an era of abundant resources and limited environmental constraints can function in a century defined by different realities. What comes next is genuinely uncertain. The feedlot system isn't going to disappear overnight. It's too embedded in our infrastructure, our economy, and our eating habits. But it's also increasingly clear that the system that emerged in the 20th century can't simply continue unchanged into the 21st. Some envision a return to more distributed, diverse agricultural systems, smaller-scale operations, more grass-fed cattle, regenerative grazing practices that rebuild soil and sequester carbon. This vision has appeal, but it faces real challenges. Can it produce enough beef for a population that's grown accustomed to abundance? Can family ranchers compete economically against consolidated corporations? Can consumers afford the higher prices that extensive systems typically require? Others see the future in technology. Not the technology of concentration and efficiency that created feedlots, but newer technologies that might obviate the need for animal agriculture altogether. Cellular agriculture, precision fermentation, and plant-based alternatives could potentially provide the taste and nutrition of meat without the environmental and ethical baggage. But these technologies remain expensive and unproven at scale. Will they truly deliver on their promise, or will they create new problems we haven't anticipated? Perhaps the most likely scenario is that we'll see all of these futures simultaneously. A more diverse food system where feedlots continue to supply the mass market while alternatives serve niche demands for different production methods, price points, and values. But even this pluralistic outcome will require significant changes to the regulatory frameworks, subsidy structures, and corporate power dynamics that currently shape the industry. What's certain is that the dark secret behind feedlots, that our abundance has been purchased at costs we've chosen not to calculate, is no longer a secret. The information is available. The research has been done. The environmental impacts, the public health consequences, the economic concentration, and the ethical questions are all documented and debated in public forums. The question now is what we choose to do with that knowledge. Do we accept the trade-offs as the necessary price of abundance? Do we demand changes to how the system operates? More regulation, better environmental controls, restrictions on antibiotics, enforcement of antitrust laws? Do we vote with our wallets, buying different kinds of meat or reducing consumption altogether? Do we support research into alternative proteins and production methods? These aren't abstract questions. They're decisions that collectively shape what kind of food system we'll have, what kind of environment we'll inhabit, and what kind of relationship we'll have with the animals and ecosystems that feed us. The feedlot stands as a monument to a particular kind of human ambition, the drive to control, optimize, and profit from nature. It has delivered abundance on a scale our ancestors couldn't have imagined. But it has also taught us, or should have taught us, that every system has limits, that every efficiency comes with costs, and that the true measure of progress isn't just how much we can produce but what kind of world we create in the process. As the sun sets over those endless pens in the Texas Panhandle, casting long shadows across thousands of cattle finishing their last months before slaughter, the question hangs in the dusty air. Was this the best we could do? Or is this the system we've inherited, the one we're now responsible for changing? The answer will be written in the choices we make. As consumers, as citizens, as a society deciding what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice for it. The feedlot story isn't finished. We're living through its next chapter right now. And what happens next is up to us. There's another story hidden inside the feedlot system, one that's even less visible than the environmental costs or the public health concerns. It's the story of the people who work there, the human beings who make this industrial meat machine function day after day. Walk into any major feedlot in Kansas, Nebraska, or Texas, and you'll notice something immediately. The workforce is overwhelmingly immigrant, primarily from Mexico and Central America. These are the people who feed the cattle, clean the pens, process the arrivals, monitor for disease, and handle the 1,000 daily tasks required to keep tens of thousands of animals alive and gaining weight. It's hard, dangerous work. Feedlot employees work in all weather conditions, 110-degree summer heat and sub-zero winter cold. They're exposed to dust that's thick with particulate matter, bacteria, and fungal spores. Studies have documented elevated rates of respiratory disease among feedlot workers, including chronic bronchitis and occupational asthma. The ammonia levels in some pens can burn the lungs and eyes. Then there's the physical danger. Cattle weighing 1,200 pounds or more can be unpredictable, especially when stressed or frightened. Workers are kicked, trampled, and crushed with disturbing regularity. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, agricultural workers, including those in cattle operations, suffer workplace injuries at rates significantly higher than most other industries. And yet, these jobs are among the better-paying opportunities available to immigrant workers in rural America. A feedlot hand might make $12 to $15 per hour, far more than minimum wage, and often more than what's available in other local industries. For workers sending remittances back to families in their home countries, these wages can be life-changing. But the economic vulnerability cuts both ways. Many feedlot workers are undocumented or work on temporary visas, which gives employers tremendous power over their lives. Workers who complain about conditions or attempt to organize risk deportation. The threat doesn't even need to be explicit. It's simply part of the understood power dynamic. Maria Elena, who worked at a Nebraska feedlot for 7 years before speaking with journalists, and who asked that her full name not be used, described the psychological toll. You know that if you push too hard, if you demand too much, you could lose everything. Not just your job, your whole life here, your ability to support your family. So you accept things. You work when you're sick. You don't complain when the safety equipment isn't provided. You just keep your head down and do the work. The processing facilities, the slaughterhouses where feedlot cattle are ultimately sent, have even more severe labor issues. These plants operate at extraordinary speeds, with workers making the same knife cuts or operating the same machinery thousands of times per day. The repetitive stress injuries are epidemic. Carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, and chronic pain are occupational hazards. But it was the COVID-19 pandemic that truly exposed the human vulnerabilities built into the meat processing system. In spring 2020, as the virus spread through the United States, meatpacking plants became major outbreak hotspots. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder on production lines, sharing break rooms and transportation. Social distancing was essentially impossible while maintaining production speeds. The consequences were devastating. By May 2020, at least 25,000 meatpacking workers had tested positive for COVID-19, and over 90 had died. At some plants, infection rates approached 50% of the workforce. Yet production continued, deemed critical infrastructure by the federal government. Workers faced an impossible choice: risk infection and potentially death, or lose their jobs and income. The pandemic revealed something fundamental about how the industrial meat system values different lives. Consumers needed their meat. Corporations needed their profits. And workers, disproportionately poor, immigrant, and non-white, were expected to risk their health to keep the system running. Jesse Garcia, whose father died of COVID-19 after contracting it at a Kansas beef processing plant, put it starkly, "My dad was a frontline worker just like nurses and doctors, but he didn't get the same respect or protection. He was treated as disposable, because that's how this industry treats people." The cattle are tracked meticulously, their health monitored constantly, everything documented. But the workers, they're just numbers on a spreadsheet. The community impacts extend beyond the workers themselves. When a mega feedlot or processing plant arrives in a rural community, it transforms the social fabric. Housing costs spike as workers flood in, straining limited supplies. Schools suddenly need to accommodate hundreds of new students, many requiring ESL services. Healthcare facilities, already stretched thin in rural areas, are overwhelmed. The tax revenues generated by these facilities rarely cover the public costs they impose. Most feedlots receive substantial tax abatements as incentives to locate in particular counties. Meanwhile, the road damage from constant heavy truck traffic, the increased demand for public services, and the environmental remediation costs fall on local taxpayers. Some communities have fought back. Garden City, Kansas, which houses several large beef processing plants, has seen ongoing tension between established residents and the immigrant workforce that makes the plants function. Brooks, Alberta, which hosts a massive beef processing facility, has struggled for decades to integrate the diverse workforce the plant requires. Other communities have tried to block feedlots from locating nearby, citing environmental concerns, property value impacts, and quality of life issues. These NIMBY, not in my backyard, battles have created a troubling pattern. Feedlots increasingly locate in communities with less political power, poorer counties, areas with higher minority populations, places desperate enough for any economic development that they'll accept the trade-offs. Dr. Steve Wing, an epidemiologist who studied industrial animal operations before his death in 2016, called this environmental racism by another name. His research documented how hog and cattle operations in North Carolina disproportionately located near communities of color and low-income areas. The pattern wasn't coincidental. It reflected deliberate choices about where resistance would be weakest and political power most limited. The human cost of cheap beef, then, includes not just the workers directly employed by the industry but entire communities reshaped by its presence. Communities that gain jobs and economic activity but lose control over their environment, their quality of life, and their destiny. To truly understand the feedlot system, you need to understand what happens to meat at the molecular level when cattle are fed grain instead of grass. Because the difference between a grass-fed steak and a feedlot steak isn't just philosophical or ethical, it's biochemical. When cattle eat grass, they're consuming a diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids, specifically alpha-linolenic acid, ALA. This omega-3 gets incorporated into the animal's tissues, including muscle meat. Grass-fed beef typically contains 2 to 3 times more omega-3s than grain-fed beef. Omega-3s are anti-inflammatory compounds associated with reduced risk of heart disease, improved brain function, and various other health benefits. Grain-fed cattle, by contrast, consume a diet high in omega-6 fatty acids from corn and soy. These omega-6 also get incorporated into tissue, but they have different biological effects, generally more pro-inflammatory. The ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in feedlot beef can be 20 to 1 or even higher, compared to roughly 3 to 1 in grass-fed beef. Now, our bodies need both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. They're both essential. But the ratio matters enormously. Evolutionary biologists estimate that human ancestors consumed omega-6 to omega-3 ratios of approximately 1 to 1 to 4 to 1. The modern American diet has ratios closer to 15 to 1 or 20 to 1, and the prevalence of feedlot meat is a significant contributor to this imbalance. Dr. Artemis Simopoulos, who has researched fatty acid nutrition for decades, argues that this ratio shift is contributing to the epidemic of inflammatory diseases in Western societies, heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, and more. While feedlot beef isn't the only culprit, it's part of a broader pattern where industrial food production has fundamentally altered the nutritional composition of what we eat. The differences go beyond fatty acids. Grass-fed beef contains higher levels of conjugated linoleic acid, CLA, a fatty acid that some research suggests may have anti-cancer properties. It has more vitamin E, an important antioxidant. It tends to be leaner overall, with less total fat and fewer calories per serving. Feedlot beef, however, has qualities that many consumers prefer. More marbling, intramuscular fat, which makes meat more tender and flavorful. That marbling is precisely what the grain feeding process is designed to create. From a culinary standpoint, the heavily marbled beef produced by feedlots, particularly the prime and choice grades, is often considered superior for its tenderness and taste. This creates an interesting paradox: the nutritional optimization and the culinary optimization point in opposite directions. The meat that tastes best to palates trained on modern beef isn't necessarily the meat that's best for long-term health. But there's another scientific dimension to the feedlot system that's even more troubling: the impact on pathogens. In the 1980s, E. coli 0157, H7 was rare. By the 1990s, it had become one of the most feared foodborne pathogens, capable of causing severe illness and death, particularly in children. Research has traced its emergence and spread directly to feedlot conditions. Dr. James Russell, a microbiologist at Cornell University, conducted groundbreaking research showing that grain feeding creates ideal conditions for E. coli 0157, H7 to develop and survive. The high-starch diet lowers the pH in the cattle's digestive system, and E. coli 0157, H7 has adapted to become acid-resistant. This means it can survive the stomach acid barrier in humans who consume contaminated beef, something most E. coli strains cannot do. Even more disturbing, Russell's research showed that switching cattle from grain back to grass for just 5 days before slaughter could reduce E. coli 0157, H7 levels by 1,000-fold. But the feedlot system rarely allows for this because those 5 days represent lost weight gain, lost profit. The same grain-based diet that makes cattle fatten efficiently also makes them more likely to harbor dangerous pathogens. It's another hidden cost of efficiency. The antibiotic story adds yet another scientific dimension. When low doses of antibiotics are continuously added to feed, bacteria don't just develop resistance, they develop it in complex, transferable ways. Bacteria can carry resistance genes on plasmids, circular pieces of DNA that can be shared between completely different bacterial species through horizontal gene transfer. This means that a harmless bacteria in a cow's gut can develop resistance to multiple antibiotics, then transfer those resistance genes to a Salmonella or E. coli bacterium, which then infects humans through the food chain. The resistance developed in feedlots doesn't stay in feedlots. It propagates through bacterial networks that ignore species boundaries. Dr. Margaret Mellon, who directed the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, spent years documenting this process. Her research showed resistance genes moving from feedlot environments into bacteria found in nearby communities, in waterways downstream from feedlots, and in retail meat products. The feedlot had become a factory not just for beef, but for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The industry has responded with some modifications, phasing out certain antibiotics, improving dosing protocols, implementing veterinary oversight. But the fundamental problem remains. When you concentrate animals in crowded conditions and feed them diets their digestive systems aren't evolved to handle, disease pressure increases. And in a system optimized for minimum cost, the cheapest solution is often antibiotics. Follow the money in the feedlot system, and you'll discover an economic structure so complex and interconnected that it touches nearly every aspect of American agriculture and international trade. Start with the grain. American corn production is a $50+ billion annual industry, and approximately 40% of the corn grown in the United States goes to feeding livestock, much of it in feedlots. This creates a massive, guaranteed market for corn farmers, a market that's essentially built into the structure of American agriculture. But corn production is itself heavily subsidized. Between 1995 and 2020, the federal government paid over $116 billion in subsidies to corn farmers through various programs: direct payments, crop insurance, disaster relief, and more. These subsidies lower the cost of corn, which in turn lowers the cost of feedlot beef. In effect, taxpayers are subsidizing cheap meat, though this connection is rarely made explicit. The subsidy structure creates perverse incentives throughout the system. Because corn is kept artificially cheap, there's little economic incentive to develop more sustainable feeding systems. Grass-fed operations can't compete on price because they're not receiving equivalent support. The playing field isn't level, it's tilted heavily toward industrial grain-fed beef. Meanwhile, the consolidation at every level of the supply chain has created unprecedented economic concentration. 4 companies control over 80% of beef slaughter capacity in the United States. This oligopoly has enormous price-setting power. When ranchers sell cattle, they typically have few options for buyers, and those buyers can effectively set prices. When consumers buy beef, they pay prices influenced by the same small group of companies. The profit margins tell a revealing story. Between 2015 and 2020, cattle ranchers saw their share of the beef dollar decline, while packers, the companies that operate both feedlots and slaughterhouses, saw profit margins surge. In 2019, major beef packers achieved profit margins of 8 to 10%, which might not sound extraordinary until you realize that margins in the industry traditionally hovered around 2 to 3%. What changed? Consolidation gave packers more power. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic forced some plant closures, cattle prices plummeted because ranchers had nowhere else to sell. But retail beef prices surged. The price spread, the difference between what ranchers received and what consumers paid, reached unprecedented levels. Someone was capturing that value, and it wasn't the ranchers or consumers. This prompted federal investigations into price fixing and antitrust violations in the beef industry. As of 2021, multiple federal agencies and state attorneys general were investigating whether the major packers had engaged in illegal coordination to suppress cattle prices and inflate beef prices. The investigations were ongoing, but they highlighted how concentration had created opportunities for market manipulation. The international trade dimension adds another layer of complexity. The United States exports approximately 10 to 15% of its beef production, primarily to Japan, South Korea, Mexico, and Canada. These export markets are crucial for maintaining profitability, especially for higher value cuts that fetch premium prices abroad. But international trade also means that feedlots are subject to global market forces. When drought in Australia reduces their beef production, U.S. exports may increase to fill the gap, affecting domestic prices. When countries like China increase beef imports as their populations grow wealthier, it pulls on American supply. The local feedlot in Kansas is plugged into a global commodity market. This globalization has winners and losers. Large, efficient feedlots with access to export markets can capture additional value. Smaller operations focused on domestic markets face intensifying competition. And consumers in developing countries increasingly eat American beef, beef produced with American water, American grain, and American land, while the environmental costs remain concentrated in the producing regions. The contract structure within the industry creates another economic dynamic that advantages large operations over small ones. Increasingly, feedlots operate on contracts with packers rather than selling cattle on the open market. A feedlot might contract to supply a certain number of cattle per month at predetermined prices, providing stability and guaranteed buyers. But getting these contracts requires scale. A packer isn't interested in contracting with a 500-head feedlot. The administrative costs don't justify it. They want contracts with operations that can supply thousands of head consistently. This drives further consolidation, as feedlots need to be large enough to access contracted markets. The financial structure of modern feedlots also reflects this drive toward scale. Building a feedlot capable of finishing 50,000 plus head requires tens of millions of dollars in investment. Land, pens, feeding equipment, water systems, manure management, veterinary facilities. Financing this requires access to significant capital, often from agricultural lending institutions or private equity firms. This creates barriers to entry that make it nearly impossible for new, independent operators to start feedlots. The market is effectively closed except to those with existing capital or willingness to take on substantial debt. And when debt loads are high, the pressure to maximize throughput and minimize costs becomes even more intense, further driving the efficiency at all costs mentality. Some economic analysts argue that the feedlot system represents a triumph of American agricultural productivity, feeding more people more cheaply than any system in human history. The average American spends only about 10% of their income on food, the lowest percentage in the world, and cheap beef is a significant component of that affordability. Others counter that this efficiency is a mirage created by externalizing costs. If the price of beef reflected the true environmental costs, water depletion, pollution remediation, climate impact, it would be vastly more expensive. If it accounted for public health costs from antibiotic resistance and foodborne illness, it would be more expensive still. The apparent efficiency exists only because society has agreed not to count certain costs. Professor Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund has calculated that if environmental and social costs were internalized, the price of industrial beef might double or even triple. At those prices, consumption patterns would shift dramatically, potentially making alternative proteins competitive and grass-fed systems economically viable. But as long as the current structure persists, with subsidies for grain, externalized environmental costs, and concentrated market power, the economic logic favors the feedlot model. Stand today on the observation deck at one of the mega feedlots in the Texas Panhandle, if they'd let you, which they mostly won't, and what you see is staggering in its scale and implications. Pens stretching to the horizon, each holding hundreds of cattle. Feed trucks moving along the fence lines, distributing precisely calibrated rations. Dust hanging in the air. the smell hitting you like a physical force. And underneath it all, the constant sound. Thousands of cattle lowing, moving, eating, existing in a space that has been engineered with one purpose in mind: converting grain to meat as efficiently as possible. This is the culmination of a 150-year transformation in how America produces food. What began as an attempt to add value to surplus grain, to turn the abundance of the Midwest into something more profitable, has become a system that now defines how most of the developed world eats meat. The feedlot system's achievements are real and significant. It has made beef affordable for tens of millions of people who couldn't have afforded it otherwise. It has reduced the land required to produce a pound of beef by approximately 60% compared to traditional grazing systems. It has created a food supply that is consistent, abundant, and, despite periodic outbreaks, generally safe by historical standards. The average American now eats approximately 60 pounds of beef per year, roughly triple the consumption of a century ago. This abundance, this cheap protein, has been achieved because the feedlot system works spectacularly well at what it was designed to do: produce large quantities of beef at the lowest possible cost. But cost, we've learned, is a complicated concept. The price tag on a pound of ground beef reflects the corn, the labor, the transportation, and the razor-thin profit margins of an intensely competitive industry. What it doesn't reflect are the depleted aquifers, the contaminated waterways, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the greenhouse gas emissions, the concentrated corporate power, and the communities that have lost their economic autonomy. These costs are real. They're just hidden, diffused across society and time in ways that don't show up at the checkout counter. The feedlot system also represents something larger, a particular vision of progress and efficiency that dominated 20th century thinking. The idea that bigger is better, that technology can solve any problem, that nature should be controlled and optimized for human benefit, that the market will sort everything out. These assumptions shaped not just agriculture but nearly every aspect of modern life. And now, in the 21st century, we're being forced to reckon with the consequences of that vision. Climate change makes it impossible to ignore the carbon intensity of our food systems. Antibiotic resistance reminds us that we can't endlessly externalize costs onto microbial ecosystems. Water scarcity highlights the limits of mining natural resources as if they're infinite. Wealth concentration demonstrates that market efficiency doesn't necessarily translate to broad-based prosperity. The feedlot, in this sense, is a microcosm, a physical manifestation of an entire approach to how humans should organize themselves on the planet. And the questions it raises aren't just about cattle or agriculture. They're about whether the systems we built during an era of abundant resources and limited environmental constraints can function in a century defined by different realities. What comes next is genuinely uncertain. The feedlot system isn't going to disappear overnight. It's too embedded in our infrastructure, our economy, and our eating habits. But it's also increasingly clear that the system that emerged in the 20th century can't simply continue unchanged into the 21st. Some envision a return to more distributed, diverse agricultural systems, smaller-scale operations, more grass-fed cattle, regenerative grazing practices that rebuild soil and sequester carbon. This vision has appeal, but it faces real challenges. Can it produce enough beef for a population that's grown accustomed to abundance? Can family ranchers compete economically against consolidated corporations? Can consumers afford the higher prices that extensive systems typically require? Others see the future in technology. Not the technology of concentration and efficiency that created feedlots, but newer technologies that might obviate the need for animal agriculture altogether. Cellular agriculture, precision fermentation, and plant-based alternatives could potentially provide the taste and nutrition of meat without the environmental and ethical baggage. But these technologies remain expensive and unproven at scale. Will they truly deliver on their promise, or will they create new problems we haven't anticipated? Perhaps the most likely scenario is that we'll see all of these futures simultaneously. A more diverse food system where feedlots continue to supply the mass market while alternatives serve niche demands for different production methods, price points, and values. But even this pluralistic outcome will require significant changes to the regulatory frameworks, subsidy structures, and corporate power dynamics that currently shape the industry. What's certain is that the dark secret behind feedlots, that our abundance has been purchased at costs we've chosen not to calculate, is no longer a secret. The information is available. The research has been done. The environmental impacts, the public health consequences, the economic concentration, and the ethical questions are all documented and debated in public forums. The question now is what we choose to do with that knowledge. Do we accept the trade-offs as the necessary price of abundance? Do we demand changes to how the system operates? More regulation, better environmental controls, restrictions on antibiotics, enforcement of antitrust laws? Do we vote with our wallets, buying different kinds of meat or reducing consumption altogether? Do we support research into alternative proteins and production methods? These aren't abstract questions. They're decisions that collectively shape what kind of food system we'll have, what kind of environment we'll inhabit, and what kind of relationship we'll have with the animals and ecosystems that feed us. The feedlot stands as a monument to a particular kind of human ambition, the drive to control, optimize, and profit from nature. It has delivered abundance on a scale our ancestors couldn't have imagined. But it has also taught us, or should have taught us, that every system has limits, that every efficiency comes with costs, and that the true measure of progress isn't just how much we can produce, but what kind of world we create in the process. As the sun sets over those endless pens in the Texas Panhandle, casting long shadows across thousands of cattle finishing their last months before slaughter, the question hangs in the dusty air. Was this the best we could do? Or is this the system we've inherited, the one we're now responsible for changing? The answer will be written in the choices we make. As consumers, as citizens, as a society deciding what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice for it. The feedlot story isn't finished. We're living through its next chapter right now. And what happens next is up to us.